Welcome to Broadcasting Common Ground, the Deep Foundation Institute's podcast channel. In this series, Morgan's Mentors, Morgan Neesmith will be talking with industry representatives about career challenges, mentor and mentee advice. In this episode, David talks about his mentors and the rewards of being a mentor.
All right, welcome to DFI's podcast channel, Broadcasting Common Ground. I am Morgan Neesmith, and it is time, once again, to move the needle with our show about mentorship and careers in the geotechnical world. Now, today we are going to dive into the sort of spooky side of geotechnics, the academic world, and our guest is Dr. David Frost of Georgia Tech. Dr. Frost is currently the Elizabeth and Bill Higginbotham Professor in the Geosystems Engineering group of Georgia Tech's School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And aside from being one of my early personal mentors, when we were first developing this program, Dr. Frost had just been awarded that school's 2020 Graduate Mentorship Award. That's why we thought he would be a great guest for us to talk to. So Dr. Frost, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Now, you may not know this, but we have dozens and dozens of fans across the world. And for those who weren't your students, we would like you to tell them a little bit about your background, where you're from, and sort of how you got to your journey in your professional history, and how you've now been at Georgia Tech for over a couple of decades now.
Okay, so I was born in Ireland and grew up there through all of my schooling and my undergraduate degrees. I went to Trinity College in Dublin and got degrees in mathematics and engineering. And then at that stage, I had already known that I was very interested in geotechnical engineering. In fact, I'd had the opportunity to work on a mining project in Ireland with a consulting firm, well-known, Golder Associates. And so I worked there during after my third and fourth years in college. And then when that project finished, I really didn't see anything else going on in Ireland at the time that excited me. And so I decided one night in a bar with a friend after several beers that maybe it would be a great idea to see and go to Canada, where there was lots of things happening at the time, particularly in the oil field and so on. And so the following morning, we had arranged to go to the Canadian Embassy to find out what we needed to do to emigrate to Canada. And when I called my friend, he must have sobered up and decided he wasn't going to go. But I decided, I am going to go in the embassy at least. And then about 6 months later, I was in Canada without a job. I just decided I'd fly over there. I had a couple of contacts, and I went to Calgary, which was kind of the Houston of Canada, if you like, from an oil perspective. And arrived on a Wednesday, and I had a job by Friday, and the rest of that is sort of history in terms of I working with in the consulting industry, but particularly in support of natural resources, mining, oil exploration, and so on. During that time, I had amazing opportunities to work in particularly northern Canada and actually north of the Arctic Circle. I spent about a year and a half total building artificial sand islands for oil exploration, living offshore, and it was a most fascinating time. And at the same token, I began to realize that I was kind of maxing out in terms of the type of roles that I was playing for the companies I was working for, based on the education I had. So I felt that I needed to go back to grad school, and initially thought I'd just go for a master's. And then so I applied to several universities, one in Canada and one in the States. And although I was admitted to both of them, I decided that lots of people in Canada were going to the Canadian university. So, as is often the case with me, I decided I needed to be different and I would go to the American university. And then the assumption was that I would be going back to Canada to work. And if I was different, even if I wasn't as good, I might get a better job, or I might have a better chance of getting the job. So I did that. The only thing was that a master's became a PhD, and somewhere in that, I decided that I really enjoyed the freedom to be my own boss as an academic. And in the end, however, I actually feel that I'm really like running a startup company, and I have been for 30 years, because there's so many similarities to running a research group as there is to running a startup company. First of all, I'm always responsible for bringing the money in to pay people. But secondly, and maybe the biggest difference, is I'm guaranteed to have 100% turnover of employees about every 3 or 4 years. So you are continuously in startup mode. And I think that's actually what attracts me to it. And it's the excitement of that, and bringing new ideas, starting new ideas, and ultimately moving new ideas out into practice as well, which attracts me to it. So that's probably a longer answer than you needed, but it kind of summarizes how somebody from a rural part of Ireland ended up in a major metropolitan area like Atlanta at one of the top universities in the world.
I thought it was a pretty good summary, actually. And now I'm glad you touched on what you've been doing the last couple of decades at Georgia Tech, because as I mentioned in the opening, you've now formally been recognized, what I think a number of your students would have been said informally about the influence you've had on their careers, and just generally always there for advice about life as well as just careers. But when you were starting out, when you were thinking about going back to school, or once you got back into school, who were some of the mentors, or could you talk about them a little bit? Were they formal relationships that you had, or and if they were informal, how did those start? In terms of who was important to you when you were needed someone to go to, say, for advice early in your decision making career.
Okay, so I don't think, as best as I can kind of look back, that I have ever actually been part of a formal mentoring program. And so I would say that all of my own mentors were informal. Some were, I would say, supervisors, but I see big differences between just a supervisor and a mentor. And to me, that's actually very important. I will say that I think in the end, I have probably had a relatively few number of formal mentors, generally at some sort of important milestone time in my career, when I was, for example, trying to make a decision. And so I relied on them for, good advice. But then an awful lot of the mentoring that I've seen over my life has been more me observing other people and picking little bits that I like. I've never tried to be a clone of somebody else. So when I look at other people, I'm like, well, I like that part of you, but I don't like this part of you. So I'm going to pick the pieces that I like and discard the pieces that maybe I don't like. Having said that, I would probably say that, the first time I really had to make an important decision was when I actually decided that I would emigrate to Canada. And so at that point in time, I talked quite a lot with my professor of soil mechanics at Trinity College in Dublin, who, by the way, Morgan, had a countenance rather similar to you, with a beard and everything. So so that made him seem very wise when I wanted to talk to him. And but it was very valuable because he really made a number of important points as I was deciding to pull up roots and head elsewhere. The next mentor that I really had was a senior engineer when I was at Golder in Calgary, and I had been working on a number of projects for the consultant, and we had a client which was one of the oil sands companies in Canada, and I'm going to give a specific example of a bit of mentoring that I received, and that was the oil company asked if I would actually consider joining them. I'm sure their vision was that if they hired me directly, it would cost them less than to hire the consultant and pay a markup of 3 point whatever it was on my salary. So the what I did was I went to my boss and mentor, and the guy's name was Jack Crooks. He happened to actually have been an Irishman also. And I remember I went into Jack's office and I said, Jack, I have a problem. I'm very happy with my job here at Golder, but I've been approached by the oil company to come and work for them. And I said, you know, in the end, it's probably increase in salary of about 50%. But I was genuinely honest that was not my motivator. And I said, you know, any thoughts about what I should do? And I remember his first words out of his mouth, he says, well, David, first of all, you don't have a problem. You have a choice because you already have a good job and you're being offered another one. And he said, the people who have a problem are the people who don't have any jobs. So, and I remember, you know, but initially my reaction wanted to be, well, thanks for wasting my time. But very quickly I thought, damn it, that is exactly the situation. It's not a problem. It's a choice. I'm struggling to make a decision. But to be honest, within about 2 days, I turned down the oil company and I stayed with the consultant, and I didn't get a pay raise, but I stayed there because I thought that it was giving me the opportunity to be involved in a much broader series of things. Probably the other mentors that I would say that I've had in my career were when I was doing my PhD, there was no doubt that my academic advisors really served as mentors for me. And I was fortunate to have two who were quite different. And so I used to go to one when I wanted to talk about certain aspects of the work, and I would go to the other when I talked about the other. And I always was very careful not to create a competition between them, but rather to integrate their inputs. And then perhaps finally, the last mentor that I can kind of highlight was when I really started to take on some significant administrative work here at Georgia Tech. The president at the time was Wayne Clough, another geotechnical engineer. And I can definitely say that observing him and his incredible leadership skills were exposed me to things that I would say made me feel, if I'm going to do stuff, that's how I'm going to do it. I like his style. Beyond that, everything else that is embodied into what I do today is really little bits and pieces that I've seen in some people, and so a number of major individuals, but not massive numbers.
I know what you mean, and I liked a couple of the things that you touched on. One in particular, that even with the informal relationships, there were just certain people that you sort of knew you could go to in pivotal moments. And that's kind of ties in nicely with what I wanted to talk about next. And like for me, example, I think back to moving to Saudi Arabia for a job opportunity. And I had no idea what I was getting into, but it turned into being a very pivotal moment for me. And that came out of a conversation that you and I had. And I was wondering if there were any sort of moments in your career, and at the time, did you think that they were going to be some sort of big break, or was it only in hindsight that you realized that was really the moment that you sort of got put on a path that really expanded your horizons and opportunities?
Yeah, the probably, one of those pivotal moments was, and I don't want to keep coming back to leaving Ireland to go to Canada, but at the time I was working with a structural steel company, and I was not enjoying the job. That was probably too much code for my liking, and I don't mean computer code. I mean, following codes and bending moment diagrams and shear force diagrams and all of that. And that was not exciting me. And so right around the time when I applied to the Canadian Embassy for immigration status, I also applied for a job with a pipeline company that was looking to hire an engineer. They would send them to France for 6 months to work with a partner there. They were going to send them to Japan to work for 6 months to work with a partner there. And then they were going to have this engineer come back to Ireland and be the sort of their pipeline expert, for want of a better term. And I use that carefully because you don't become an expert after 6 months in France and 6 months in Japan. And then obviously things started to develop also with respect to Canada. And I remember at the time there I was facing, so what do? Do I stay in Ireland and just continue working with the steel company even though I hate it? Do I maybe go a little riskier and do 6 months in France and 6 months in Japan and then become the resident pipeline guru? Or do I go to Canada without a job? And fairly quickly, I decided the hardest of those things to do was to go to Canada without a job. And that's what attracted me to it, because I felt if I did anything other than the most difficult thing, I would always be wondering, could I have done it? Would I have done it? And so for me at the time, that was actually somewhat insightful, because it made me realize whenever I come to a fork in the road, I don't want to be a gambler, but don't take the conservative step. There is no upper bound to what you can do if you are willing to put yourself out there for opportunities. So that's probably, a clear example. Maybe a little bit when I had the situation with staying with the consultant or going to the oil company was somewhat similar as well. But probably the original case in Ireland was the most significant one.
And I think any students or young engineers could benefit from hearing that, again, the way you put that, there is no upper bound. That's an important point, I think, for them to hear early in their careers. We're going to shift just a little bit from your progression to sort of what you've observed, maybe in students in particular. I was a student of yours, it turns out, this year. 25 years ago, I graduated, and things have changed somewhat since then. I've seen it certainly from the corporate side in terms of, I think, the way companies treat young engineers and what young engineers expect from companies in terms of a little more formality and training and leadership. There's a little bit less of, we're going to toss you out and you're either going to make it or you're not. And I don't think anyone agrees that was necessarily the right approach. But at the same time, I think students still need to bring something to the table. And I am curious as to what you see, particularly, let's say, on a graduate level. Is there a characteristic that you see in a student that makes you think, I don't really know what they're going to do when they graduate, but they're going to be fine. They're going to make it, as opposed to maybe someone you have a little bit more questioning about in terms of how they are going to do after they graduate.
So I have a couple of thoughts related to that, Morgan. So first of all, and I say this many times to other colleagues, not just at Georgia Tech, but elsewhere. And I say at times that any faculty member can advise and mentor an exceptional student. And quite often, the ones that are, to me, more important are the ones that you have to work more with to actually help them realize their potential. And so, for example, when I go to recruit students to come and join work with me and so on, I'm not just looking at GPA. I want to see what are these other characteristics that I see in this person. And so I'm actually somewhat famous. I should probably not be saying this in public, but I'm somewhat famous for calling students who have applied to come to graduate school out of the blue. I don't arrange the phone call. I just, I get their phone number or whatever. Nowadays, maybe it's Zoom calls sometimes. And I just, all of a sudden, they pick up the phone and there I am. And the reason I do that is that I don't want them to prepare for the call. I want to see them, who they are, and I want them to be able to react to a situation that they hadn't been planning for. And obviously, quite a few students end up coming and joining me. And that's one of the things they always tell me after. So I couldn't believe you when you called me. I was in the middle of breakfast and all of a sudden you were on the phone and I didn't know what to say and everything. I said, well, you must have said the right things because you're here now and working with me. One of the things that I think is very important when it comes to mentoring, first of all, is the context that students see you in. And you may or may not have noticed it, but I always talk about students who work with me, not students who work for me. And that's not just bad English or something like that. That is it's a very clear message of what I want to send. It's the same as if we were in industry, there'd be senior engineers, intermediate engineers, junior engineers, but guess what? We're all engineers. The same thing applies in academia as far as I'm concerned. There may be senior professors, there may be junior professors, there may be grad students, but we're all geotechnical academics. And so the idea that we work together and not that somebody's working for somebody is critically important for me. The other side of it then, though, is that when it really comes and a student is here and they're working with me, what is most important for me is I want to see that they are enthusiastic for their work. I don't want to feel that I'm having to, drag them here. I want to see that they're excited about their work. I want to see that they are coming up with ideas themselves. It's not that I want to send them off and say, okay, run these 3 tests and then come back to me, show me the results, and I'll tell you what they mean. I say to them, no, run the tests and then come back and tell me what you think they mean. And so it's that working with, it's that interaction, which I think is critically important to the mentoring part of it. And then the other thing that I definitely like to see, even with graduate students, is that they step up and help fellow graduate students, they help undergraduate students, and that they're genuinely excited themselves it's never too early to start behaving a little bit like a mentor, because by the time they graduate, and let's say, for example, whether they go to industry or academia themselves, the day they stop being a graduate student on one side of the desk and move to my side of the desk or your side of the desk, they need to be comfortable that now people who are more junior to them can go to them and expect good advice, reliable advice, and good guidance and good mentoring. So that's those are some of the, I think, important things that I look for when I'm not only selecting students, but then have students working with me.
I like it. And along with those lines, in terms of maybe preparing to be in a mentorship role as they come out of graduate school, one thing that I've noticed is maybe a little more over the past decade is somewhat of a fear of, I hate to, I'm not really going to say failure, but really more of a desire to be thought of as perfect coming out of graduate school, or a fear of being thought of as less than perfect. When I know that if you're just coming out of school, you're a young engineer, you don't know everything. That's not what we expect. But I think it's helpful for younger engineers to hear from some people with more experience about, whether it was an actual engineering problem or a career thing, that something that just didn't go quite right or the way that you initially thought it would, and why that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. How did that turn into a positive experience, even though at the time it looked like it wasn't going the way you initially thought it was?
So probably for me, certainly something that would fall into that category, and it's not a geotechnical failure, but I had a significant administrative role here at Georgia Tech for about 10 years, from around 2000 to about 2010. And that was involved with literally establishing and building the Georgia Tech Savannah campus. And I was serving as the director of that activity. And there was a change in leadership at Georgia Tech, and the vision of the new leadership was that we did not need a campus in Savannah. And so literally in a very short period, a decision was made to essentially mothball the campus and the academic programs, and the data will show it, but we were on a very sharp trajectory of growth. Things were going extremely well. There was a wonderful relationship between that campus and the Southeast Georgia business and communities and everything. And so all of a sudden, that was certainly a change that I had not initially anticipated, and it certainly was not one that was open for discussion. It was, a fait accompli when I was told about it. And fairly quickly, I realized that I could get very frustrated, and I could turn around and say, okay, well, I'm a tenured faculty member, and I'm not going to do a damn thing for the next 15 or 20 years. And because you've kind of pulled the carpet from underneath me. And instead, I essentially took the complete opposite tact, and I said, no, I don't want to spend the next X years of my life being frustrated. I am going to completely go back to being a faculty member, interacting with students, teaching, research, doing service, professional service, and so on. And I can tell you that 10 years later, I have had the most, and I still am having the most amazing time and probably something that I'm going to say that if there are academic administrators listening here who may not be happy with me, graduate students and undergraduate students, quite honestly, are often much more fun to interact with than administrators. I think sometimes in academic world, there's a lot of echo chambers. And to me, I find the creativity that exists when you're part of a team that's made up of students and exploring research and or even in the classroom and, you know, doing term projects and so on. That's a far more exciting environment. So to me, I had a change imposed on me. I was not planning to make that change, but to be honest, I am totally happy that it happened or it occurred, and it's probably taken me to places where I might not even have otherwise thought about going. So.
And I knowing a little bit about that story personally, I appreciate that you shared it, because it's exactly the kind of thing I was thinking along the lines of something in my own career. It was not nearly as dramatic, but similar sort of circumstances. And just thinking about how things have gone since then, I think, again, the more students and young engineers can hear that, maybe they won't worry so much about when those kinds of things crop up and maybe take it so hard. We are planning on talking to a variety of guests across the geotechnical industry. So in talking about the research and academics specifically, beyond just taking the classes, what is it that graduate students can really do to prepare themselves if they think to themselves, I really want to go into this. I like the way Dr. Frost handles himself, and that's what I want to do with my career. What can they be doing, again, beyond just taking the right classes and doing the right research? So can they be doing to prepare themselves for that kind of career?
So I think the first thing I'll say is that I've been very fortunate to work, for example, with a large number of PhD students and a number of master's students as well, who have gone on to positions in academia themselves. In fact, about 50% of the graduate students that have worked with me are now in academic positions. And I think in part, some of that is not because I told them to go into academia, but because they had such a wonderful experience being part of the kind of environment and the group that I know I try to create, that it made them realize that's what I want to do. That's the excitement. That's what I want to do. And now, in order to do that, though, for example, it's not just about, okay, take 10 classes and get, 9 A's and a B and do some good research and write a thesis. To me, I think part of what makes academia exciting for people is to see and have the opportunity while a student to be exposed to other parts of it. For example, I very much like to try and include site visits in just about all of my classes. And the reason I do is because, first of all, even if I think I've done a great lecture in class, it's what they see when they go to the site, and they interact with engineers from whatever the company might be, whatever the project might be at the time. That's where it becomes reality. I often use the expression that when you open up a textbook and you look at a picture of an excavation, it is perfectly vertical sides and the groundwater is off the bottom of the page. And I'm not sure I've ever gone to a real excavation where, some of the side slopes aren't sloughing in, and there's water coming in places that you have no idea where it came from. And so, first of all, getting them to see how being in academia does not separate you from practice. In fact, if anything, you can embrace practice and have exciting interactions by trying to bridge that activity is important. The second thing, though, is that I encourage students working with me to really try and explore things like entrepreneurship and creativity. And so I mentioned, 50% of the students who've worked with me are in academia, but I would say probably 20% of the students who've worked with me are either owners of their own companies, or at least co-owners, or have risen up into the leadership positions in companies. And I think that is also because they get exposed early in their careers to see that a career is not just about technical knowledge, but it can be also about managing ideas, managing people, coming up with creative solutions. I'm not saying this because I happen to be talking to one, but right now, but I, in a general sense, feel that specialty contractors are some of the most creative organizations out there, because if you can be creative and innovative, that feeds back into project success and profit. And so to me, that's something that I think makes it very exciting. You're not just doing cookie cutter engineering. You're really trying to say, well, we know where we need to get. How can we get there? And what are some new ideas or approaches that we might take? So,
well, we do appreciate the shout out for sure.
Yes.
But that was, again, I appreciate the answer, and it's time right now for us to take a very brief break. We're going to recognize the sponsor of this week's episode, Cone Tech, and thank them. And we're going to hear from them now, and we'll be back in a minute. Okay, well, we want to thank Dr. Frost again for joining us today. But before we go, David, there's one question that we were asking everyone that comes on the podcast and joins us here. If you could interview anyone, living or not, for this particular podcast, who would that be and why?
So I'm going to give you a non-geotech, and it's also somebody who's no longer living, so probably won't be able to interview them for the podcast. But for a variety of reasons, somebody that I think I would find fascinating to interview for this podcast would be Mohandas Gandhi. You didn't see that coming, did you?
No.
I remember growing up, I always thought he was what I would call a fascinating individual. He had great vision, but he was obviously very much wanted to make change happen from a peaceful point of view. And to be honest, we have a number of even people nowadays and more recently in our own times who rise to that. They very much want to take peaceful approaches to being a force for change. What I particularly like, though, about Gandhi is I always felt that he had ideas and vision which were different. He was comfortable and willing to question things that lots of people said, oh, well, let's assume this. And in the end, that can sometimes constrain what you do. So from that point of view, I've always just had a great admiration for him. I went to India after the 2001 Bhuj earthquake, and needless to say, going to an earthquake zone, and also certain areas that I visited, even in the best of times, there was lots of poverty and let's say less than wonderful conditions. And then the last day I was there, I happened to go to his compound in a town called Ahmedabad. And what was amazing was you turned in the gate to the compound, and there was just immediately a sort of a very calm feeling. People, there was all the hustle and bustle outside, all of the craziness and everything. And then once you were inside there, it was just a peaceful place. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, this does not surprise me, this contrast, simply because of what I had come to appreciate of him as an individual. And so, yeah, probably not your standard answer for a DFI podcast related question. But, in the end, the short answer is I'm interested in interacting with good people and people who have who care for other people, and it's not about themselves, it's about lifting other people up. I think that's what's particularly important.
And I think there are those of us out there who would argue that that's what's made you such an effective mentor over the years. But I appreciate it. I think it was a great answer, and I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us. Also, for all the dozens and dozens of fans out there, we appreciate all of you tuning in and listening, and we look forward to you joining us again for our future episodes as we talk to more of Morgan's mentors. And until then, remember, the truth will send a ripple through your body.
On behalf of DFI, we hope you enjoyed this episode. The views, information, and opinions expressed during Deep Foundation Institute's podcasts are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of DFI. DFI does not verify or take responsibility for the accuracy of the information contained, nor does it warrant that the information contained herein is suitable for any general or specific use. The podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. Editing, modification, or redistribution of this podcast is prohibited. Sponsored by Dan Brown and Associates and Cone Tech. Thanks for your time. Keep on surviving.